Is India about to face even harsher consequences from the U.S.? It's been a constant player on the global stage, but recent statements from former President Donald Trump are raising the stakes in U.S. India relations. Trump has hinted at a potential Phase 2 and Phase 3 of sanctions against India. But why? What's really going on, and what could it mean for the U.S., India, and the world at large? With everything from trade wars to security alliances being reshaped, this issue could change the trajectory of international relations as we know them. Let's break it down. To understand why Trump's comments are causing such a stir, we need to take a step back and look at the context. India is one of the world's largest economies and has been an essential partner for the U.S. in Asia, particularly with regard to countering China's growing influence. However, despite these strategic ties, India's actions in recent years have raised concerns in Washington. From defense deals with Russia to controversial policies on Kashmir, tensions are starting to simmer. Now, with Trump publicly pointing to possible sanctions, the stakes are even higher. You might wonder, what's at risk here? For the U.S., India is not just a market for goods and services, it's a geopolitical ally in the fight against authoritarian powers like China and Russia. For India, the U.S. is a critical partner in defense, technology, and trade. A sharp deterioration in relations could severely impact global economic trends, influence military alliances, and shift the balance of power in Asia. But what exactly are these Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions, and why are they coming into play right now? Let's dive deeper. What are Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions? To fully understand what Trump might mean by Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions, we first need to grasp the mechanics of U.S. sanctions and how they evolve. Sanctions are typically imposed as a way for the U.S. to address a range of issues, including violations of international laws, human rights abuses, or national security concerns. They come in different forms and levels of severity, and they are often applied incrementally. The term Phase 1 sanctions usually refers to the initial targeted measures that affect specific individuals or entities. Think of asset freezes, travel bans, or limited trade restrictions. These measures are meant to send a strong message without immediately hurting an entire economy. However, when a country fails to comply or continues its controversial actions, the U.S. government might move to Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions. These phases represent a significant escalation. Phase 2 sanctions could include broader economic restrictions that target entire industries, such as technology, energy, or defense sectors. For example, U.S. companies might be banned from doing business with certain Indian firms, or India might be cut off from receiving certain technologies critical to its economic growth. This can drastically affect both the target nation and companies worldwide, as global supply chains are interconnected. Phase 3 sanctions are even more severe, potentially aimed at crippling the entire economy of the sanctioned country. These could include blanket bans on all trade or financial transactions, essentially isolating the country from the global financial system. For India, a Phase 3 sanctions scenario would be devastating. India is a massive market for U.S. exports, and American companies have a significant stake in the country. Cutting off trade and technology access would disrupt industries like tech, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing. This would also impact Indian consumers who rely on American goods and services. Moreover, Phase 3 sanctions could have a strategic impact, severing diplomatic and military cooperation, undermining regional security alliances, and fracturing economic ties that have been built over decades. For Trump, mentioning these phases could signal a serious commitment to applying pressure on India and potentially a turning point in U.S.-India relations. Number 2. The Russian factor. S-400 deal. One of the most contentious issues between the U.S. and India in recent years has been the latter's decision to purchase the Russian S-400 missile defense system. The deal, valued at approximately $5 billion, was signed by India in 2018, and it immediately caught the attention of the U.S. government. The S-400 is considered one of the most advanced air defense systems in the world, capable of tracking and intercepting a wide range of missiles and aircraft. While this might seem like a strategic move for India, especially given its security concerns with neighboring countries like Pakistan and China, it placed India in direct opposition to U.S. policy. The U.S. has implemented a law known as the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA, which targets countries that engage in significant transactions with Russia, particularly in the defense sector. The act was initially intended to curb Russia's influence globally by penalizing countries that engage with its defense industry. By signing the S-400 deal with Russia, India put itself in the crosshairs of this law. The U.S. warned India that continuing the deal could lead to severe consequences, including potential sanctions. India, however, defended its decision as one based on its national security needs, citing the need to bolster its defense capabilities amidst growing concerns over China's military expansion in the region. The problem for the U.S. is that its strategic interests in the region heavily rely on India as a counterbalance to China's growing dominance. India is a crucial partner in the Indo-Pacific, and any drastic deterioration in relations between the U.S. and India could undermine the broader efforts to contain China's influence. For the U.S., applying sanctions on India due to the S-400 deal might create a dilemma. It risks damaging a key ally and weakening its position in the region. However, failing to act might undermine the credibility of the CAATSA law and send a message that U.S. policy on Russian sanctions is flexible depending on the geopolitical context. In this delicate situation, Trump's threat of Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions could be an effort to force India to choose between its growing defense ties with Russia and its long-standing partnership with the U.S. This could have massive ramifications for India, which relies on Russia for much of its defense equipment, while also maintaining a strong security and trade relationship with the United States. Trump's pressure on India could be an attempt to create a situation where India has to choose sides in the ongoing global struggle for influence between the U.S. and Russia. Ultimately, the S-400 deal has placed India in a precarious position, and Trump's potential sanctions could be the next step in this evolving geopolitical tug-of-war. Number 3. Kashmir and human rights concerns, another key issue that could push the U.S. toward implementing Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions on India is the ongoing situation in Kashmir. In 2019, India's government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, made a controversial decision to revoke Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. This article had granted special autonomy to the region of U.S. Jammu and Kashmir, allowing it to have its own laws, its own flag, and certain political rights that were not available to other Indian states. By scrapping Article 370, India effectively stripped Kashmir of its special status, which many saw as a step toward consolidating control over the disputed region. The decision was met with widespread international criticism, particularly from human rights organizations and neighboring countries like Pakistan. Many argue that the revocation of Article 370 undermines the political and civil rights of Kashmiri Muslims who constitute the majority of the region's population. Reports of mass arrests, communication blockades, curfews, and heavy military presence in Kashmir have raised alarms about the suppression of political freedoms and civil rights. For India, the region's integration into the national fold is seen as a matter of territorial integrity, especially as Kashmir has been the subject of a long-standing dispute with Pakistan, which claims the region as its own. However, for much of the international community, this action is seen as an infringement on the rights of the people of Kashmir, particularly their right to self-determination. In response to these concerns, several U.S. lawmakers, human rights organizations, and international bodies have called for sanctions or other punitive measures against India. While the U.S. government has largely been supportive of India's strategic importance in the region, these human rights concerns cannot be easily dismissed. The situation has put Washington in a delicate position. On one hand, India is a key ally in the fight against authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. On the other hand, the U.S. cannot completely ignore the human rights violations reported in Kashmir without facing backlash both domestically and internationally. If Trump follows through with threats of sanctions in Phase 2 and Phase 3, the sanctions may be an attempt to force India to address these human rights issues, particularly by pushing for greater autonomy and freedoms for the Kashmiri people. For India, the implications of these sanctions would be severe. The country prides itself on its democratic values, and the U.S. sanctioning it over Kashmir could undermine India's image on the global stage. It could also disrupt trade and defense agreements with the U.S., especially considering that India is a major partner in the Indo-Pacific region. The dispute over Kashmir highlights a fundamental clash of values between the U.S. and India. Where the U.S. sees the need for international human rights standards, India views its actions as a matter of sovereignty and national security. This tension could fuel further sanctions or diplomatic isolation if left unresolved. Number 4. China, a bigger geopolitical play. When we talk about U.S.-India relations, we can't ignore the massive shadow cast by China. India's location in the Indo-Pacific region, coupled with its growing economy and military capabilities, makes it an essential player in the broader strategic competition between the U.S. and China. The U.S. has long viewed India as a crucial partner in its efforts to contain China's rise as a global superpower. This partnership is often referred to as the Indo-Pacific strategy, a framework aimed at ensuring that no single nation, particularly China, dominates the region. India is not just a military ally in this struggle, it is also a key economic partner and a democratic counterweight to China's increasingly authoritarian policies. As China seeks to extend its influence through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and assertive actions in the South China Sea, India has become a bulwark for the democratic world in maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. This geopolitical context adds an additional layer of complexity to the current sanctions debate. However, India's relationship with Russia complicates its role as a key U.S. ally in this region. While the U.S. has been working to strengthen ties with India, it is simultaneously trying to curb Russia's influence, particularly in military matters. Russia remains one of India's primary defense suppliers, and deals like the S-400 missile defense system purchase reinforce this long-standing relationship. The U.S. has made it clear that its support for India is contingent on New Delhi, distancing itself from Russia, particularly in terms of defense procurement. This leaves India in a difficult position. On one hand, its defense ties with Russia have been a pillar of its security policy for decades, dating back to the Cold War. On the other hand, India recognizes the growing importance of its relationship with the U.S., especially in countering China's aggression and expanding influence in Asia. If the U.S. imposes sanctions on India for its defense ties with Russia, it could create a significant dilemma for India. A breakdown in U.S.-India relations could not only undermine their shared security interests, but also weaken the broader Indo-Pacific strategy designed to counter China. The prospect of Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions is not just about a single issue. It's about the larger geopolitical balance of power. If the U.S. moves forward with these sanctions, it could potentially push India closer to Russia, making it more difficult for Washington to secure Indian cooperation in the long-term struggle with China. For India, balancing these two relationships, one with the U.S. and one with Russia, becomes increasingly precarious. And if sanctions take full effect, the impact would not be limited to just India and the U.S. It would reshape the entire security and economic landscape of the Indo-Pacific, with China watching closely, ready to seize any opportunity to expand its influence further. Number 5. The economic impact of sanctions. The economic consequences of potential Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions on India would be far-reaching, not just for the country itself, but also for the global economy. India, as the world's fifth-largest economy, plays a significant role in international trade, manufacturing, technology, and services. A move by the U.S. to impose these severe sanctions would not only disrupt India's own economic stability, but would also have ripple effects across the global financial system. Let's break down exactly what these impacts could look like and why they matter. India's economy has been growing rapidly in recent years, bolstered by its large young population, a burgeoning middle class, and a growing tech industry. It is one of the key players in global supply chains, particularly in sectors like information technology, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing. The U.S. is one of India's largest trading partners, with billions of dollars in bilateral trade in goods and services every year. If the U.S. moves to impose sanctions in Phase 2 and Phase 3, it would likely target key sectors of India's economy, such as technology and defense, both of which have significant ties to American companies. For example, the U.S. is home to some of the biggest tech firms in the world, like Google, Microsoft, and Intel, which all rely on Indian talent and production facilities for various operations. Sanctions could disrupt these partnerships, making it more difficult for U.S. companies to collaborate with Indian firms, or for Indian firms to access crucial technologies and investment. Furthermore, India is a major player in the global pharmaceutical industry, producing generic drugs for markets around the world, including the U.S. In fact, India is often referred to as the pharmacy of the world, as it provides a significant portion of the U.S.'s generic medications. If sanctions were placed on India, it could disrupt the flow of these critical medicines, creating shortages and pushing up prices globally. This would not only harm the health systems in both countries, but could also destabilize markets that rely heavily on India's pharmaceutical exports. For instance, India's vaccine production capacity was pivotal in the global fight against COVID-19, and any disruption here could have international ramifications. Another economic area that would feel the impact of these sanctions is India's defense industry. India is one of the largest importers of defense equipment in the world, and much of this equipment comes from the U.S. or through U.S.-supported deals. The U.S. has sold billions of dollars worth of military equipment to India in recent years, positioning India as a key strategic partner in countering China's growing military power in the region. Sanctions targeting the defense sector could hinder India's ability to access the cutting-edge military technology it needs to maintain its security and bolster its defense capabilities. In addition to the direct economic hits, the global perception of India's market stability could be tarnished. Investors typically shy away from countries that are subject to international sanctions, as these restrictions signal potential instability or uncertainty. If the U.S. sanctions India, it could lead to a decline in foreign direct investment, FDI, as businesses become wary of the risks involved in working with India. The Indian stock market could also see a downturn, with foreign investors pulling their funds in anticipation of economic turmoil. This would make it harder for India to finance key infrastructure projects, technological innovations, and other growth initiatives, potentially stalling its economic momentum and undermining decades of progress. The economic consequences would not only be felt by India, but could have ripple effects globally. Multinational corporations with interests in both the U.S. and India would be caught in the crossfire. Companies in sectors ranging from tech to finance to manufacturing would face disruption in supply chains, difficulty accessing talent, and regulatory challenges. The interdependent nature of the global economy means that sanctions on India would inevitably affect markets worldwide, especially as both countries play crucial roles in international trade and finance. Moreover, the U.S. would not escape unscathed. While the primary target of sanctions would be India, American companies and industries that rely on Indian labor, services, and markets would also face economic consequences. Many American companies depend on outsourcing to India for services like customer support, back-office operations, and software development. These companies would be forced to find alternative markets or face higher costs, as shifting operations away from India would require significant time and resources. Additionally, with India being a massive market for American goods, the sanctions could negatively affect U.S. exports, hurting sectors like agriculture, energy, and technology. In conclusion, the economic fallout from Phase 2 and Phase 3 sanctions on India would be felt across borders. India's economy, deeply integrated into the global supply chain, would face substantial disruption. The pharmaceutical industry could be particularly vulnerable, and both India's tech and defense sectors could suffer long-term setbacks. Meanwhile, global markets, multinational corporations, and even the U.S. economy could experience knock-on effects that make the decision to sanction India a complex and costly one. Therefore, before any sanctions are imposed, policymakers must weigh the broader economic consequences and consider the long-term implications for international trade, investment, and global stability.